Grab your beverages and turn up your interweb. Solving the world's problems 12 ounces at a time. It's Dudes and Beer. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to episode 330 of the Dudes and Beer podcast. 330, folks. I remember when we did episode 300, I did the nerd math. And at that point, we were well over a month of content. Like, you could listen to Dudes and Beer for about 30 days straight. And good God, I know that episode 300 in itself was 8.5 hours long. So, we're almost to 40 days of content right now over the many years. And I love my show. I love this audience. I love the conversations that we have had from the days where we were literally sitting around a table with Nelson Kugel and Stephen Bishop and Fitz and Julie Connolly. And when we first started having people like Billy Joe Kane come on talking about his new VR software, now 5 years old, that was groundbreaking in the world of teaching people empathy with human trafficking, to guests like tonight, Dr. John Hall, one of the guests who we thank regularly, along with people like Billy Joe Kane, along with people like Mike Turber, along with people like our good guest Mark Fiorentino, our first guest this evening, who have come on the show and shared certain truths, and not only that, but shared the show with their audience and grown our listener base. And it is that mutual effort to shine a light from under the bushel, so to speak, that I think gets us somewhere as humanity. And trigger alert, everybody, just so you know, our later part of the episode with Dr. John Hall will be like a shining, blinding light from under the bushel basket. I am here to tell you, folks, you can start trying to Google it before we have him on. We will Google it while we're on air on a computer that has never, ever looked it up. My graphics machine over here has had footage ingested from it that I brought in today, but it has never, ever, ever Googled the House panel on the origins of the coronavirus, which just happened 2 weeks ago. And I'm here to tell you, it was beyond out of control, folks. We're going to be getting into all of that tonight. It's going to be bombshell once we have Dr. John Hall on talking about that yet again. And our guest tonight, Mark Fiorentino, no less bombshell. He is the author of the amazing book, Master of Reality, which really goes into the concept of relativity beyond where the grand unified theory goes. And his work that he has put out that we'll be talking about tonight, which he sent me a copy of, the theory of super relativity. Like, oh my God. I mean, even by the time you get to page 4, like this is 2 pages after the table of contents, folks, you're starting to get into gravitational fields, slip waves, things like that. We are going to be talking about the absolute reality of the technology that could be the source of the UAPs seen in the released videos from the Nimitz, and of course mentioned in the recent disclosed, the entire 9-page document declassified by the U.S. government about UAPs and UAP technology. So we will be getting into that. We will be getting into so many things right after we get into our first couple segments here. Once again, there's our groovy sound. Let's get into some of the Dudes and Beer news of the week. We, of course, post all of this on our Facebook group. This is what spurs our conversations. This is what's going on. This was shared to me today by a listener and friend from My Patriots Network. Spooky. Patent filed to enable humans to walk through walls. Another one, this one out of Mysterious Universe. New Navy witness says he saw a Tic Tac operating underwater, and we will be talking about that. We, of course, talked about the possibility of that technology from the lectures of Jack Safrati with our good friend Mike Turber. We will be talking about that tonight with Mark Fiorentino and his work with super relativity. Out of the Washington Post, super fun. A gun covered in Legos to look like a toy sets off a furor. One out of Vice, U.S. British Olympic workers arrested in Tokyo for allegedly using cocaine. Russia shows a video of a tank with, quote, shields destroying incoming missiles. That at a tweak town. Pretty wild stuff. And I posted a funny article about how 35 years later, aliens really doesn't make us look good if you look at it from the aliens' point of view. And, of course, out of CNN, the news that there was a wild chase following the recent assassination of Haiti's president. I am doing some digging with a couple people into that right now to try to put an episode together about that and why there were 2 American citizens wrapped up in that. All kinds of fun stuff. But yeah, we woke up about a week ago, about last Thursday, to find out that the president of Haiti had been assassinated in the middle of the night. And that ensued into a wild roundup of people. So interesting stuff. If you're into things like that, if you're into conversations involving that kind of stuff, open conversations with people you may not agree with, but that's what makes the world go round. That is literally what this show's all about, is having those conversations. We'll be having a conversation similar to that, one that you may have had with family, friends, co-workers. You may have gotten fired because you got into it with your boss about, yeah, UFOs exist. I didn't. I'm just giving an example. It may have happened to you. I'm nowhere near that hardcore. But Mark Fiorentino, we will be talking to tonight about his book, Master of Reality, as well as the great work on super relativity, the possibilities of moving fields around vehicles, not moving vehicles through the air, all kinds of fun stuff. Mark Fiorentino, our guest this evening, everybody. Stay tuned for that when we get back from this message from our sponsor, Podcast Cadet. Have you considered starting a podcast? Looking for a way to make your business a voice of authority in an industry? Then Podcast Cadet is the solution for you. Whether starting a podcast for yourself, your brand, business, school, church, or just plain fun, Podcast Cadet is here to help you navigate the waters of the podcast industry. Specializing in one-on-one consultation and training with industry professionals in fields ranging from podcast technology and editing to distribution, monetization, and even social media strategies. Podcast Cadet tailors their services to the specific needs of you and your podcast. Do you already have a podcast and trying to find ways to engage and grow your audience? Sign up for your Podcast Cadet audit today and let us help you explore new and exciting ways to leverage your content and elevate your podcast brand to whole new levels. From consultational workshops to affordable podcast production and maintenance packages, Podcast Cadet is your one-stop shop for everything podcast related on the internet. Visit podcastcadet.com today to sign up for your consultation or training and use code DUDES20 to save 20% off your entire purchase. That website again is podcastcadet.com. And don't forget, your host, Chris Jordan, right here, full disclosure, one of the founders of Podcast Cadet. Podcast Cadet will actively be in Houston, Texas this weekend. Yeah, at the amazing Comic Palooza. I am a nerd at heart. Deep down, like about maybe a micron or two under my alabaster freckled skin. I am a nerd, if you can't tell people by all the decorations behind me. I mean, good God, I got a Jerry Bear Beanie Baby on my shelf. If you think I'm not a nerd, right next to a Geiger counter. If you think I'm not a nerd, you got an issue with yourself. But Podcast Cadet will be right there in Houston at the amazing Comic Palooza this week doing our podcast boot camp. And I can't wait. We always have a great time doing that. going out, teaching people about the art of podcasting. Stop on by, check it out. Podcastcadet.com is the website. While you're online checking that out, before you go and check out the amazing work of Mark Fiorentino at his website, super-reality.com, and before you go to curiousrealm.com, our new incarnation, make darn tootin' sure, everybody, that you stop on by our other sponsor, True Hemp Science. True Hemp Science is right here in Austin, Texas, and they are home to some of the best darn CBD product found. I travel around the country as an AV technician, and I'm here to tell you right now, despite any dispensaries I've been to, things like that, because the doctor has prescribed CBD to me for the last 3 years as supplemental for my anxiety meds. And my doctor saw the benefit in it. She put it on my recommended list. Since then, I've been visiting places looking for it. Christopher Lynch at True Hemp Science is hands down the best stuff that I have found. I found him at a farmer's market here in Austin, and they produce their own stuff. They make it all through a utterly natural process, whole plant extract, spagyric process where everything is used, then destroyed, and the remnants of that are used, then that destroyed. Utterly fantastic.
That a cloud of hydrogen gas could just form a star. There had to have been something to draw the hydrogen in to overcome the repulsive effects of the hydrogen atoms. And the only logical, sensible thing was there had to have been a very strong gravitational force, which still holds the sun together now, because that atmosphere is like millions of hydrogen bombs going off continuously. What in heck could be holding that together? There has to be in the center of the sun a solid, heavy, extremely dense object. And the only thing that can do that is neutronium core, which if we look at other examples of stars that blow up, always what's left is a neutronium core. And all I'm saying is that thing was already there. It wasn't created by the explosion, which doesn't really make sense. The neutronium core was there, and what happens is when you got a supernova, the atmosphere is blown off because of the fusion process gets so intense that it can no longer hold the atmosphere, and it's blown away in a colossal release of energy, revealing what was there all along, which created that star in the first place.
That's really, I've just put up an article from Stack Exchange on astronomy talking about can the sun contain degenerate matter. And, that is a really interesting concept because, of course, not that gases don't have mass, but gases, even in abundance, would not have enough mass to create gravity to attract other gases. Not enough gravity to, at least not through my understanding of it. And that's what you're saying. They wouldn't have enough specific gravity, even rotating together, all together, to be able to attract other gases to it to cause fusion, everything else.
Send me that link. I saw enough just in that brief moment to say, hey, these guys kind of know what they're doing here.
That was literally the first. I'll take you back a page so you can see exactly sun neutronium core. That is exactly what I Googled, and that's what came up was astronomy stack exchange. I mean, really interesting. We're gonna we'll you and I will have to get a hold of Robert Sawyer there, apparently the author of the book The Oppenheimer Alternative. Talking about these kind of things. So very much an interesting concept. And, of course, them talking about the Oppenheimer alternative is, of course, a reference to the great experiment done by Oppenheimer, the nuclear bomb, which was a hydrogen bomb, but one of the things that he considered was the concept of a neutron bomb.
Right.
And that's what he's talking about. Would be the using of a neutron bomb and the technology behind that. So, but yeah, just wild to know that once again this kind of technology, though what you're talking about seems far-fetched science fiction, not so much, Mark.
No, not at all. And when you think, well, you have to think about, okay, all right, so let's just say all stars are built with neutronium cores. Where do they come from? And
Yes.
and then that is triggered by the intelligent design theory that is part of the theory of super relativity. And I says, well, wait a minute. There's a mystery concerning the neutron that's never really been explained, and that one is this. When a neutron, one single neutron, is isolated by itself, within 15 minutes, it turns into a hydrogen atom, a proton and an electron. And when I realized that, while that may be a mystery to physicists, that makes perfect sense to me, because at the beginning of the universe, what do you need? You need massive amounts of hydrogen to build stars and galaxies. So that means that was no accident that the neutron was designed to do that in that circumstance. But in other circumstances, the neutron never decays, as when it's grouped together with other neutrons or other protons and elements, then it becomes extremely stable. So that really makes sense. So at the beginning of the universe, the thing that blew up, the cosmic egg, was no doubt neutronium, and a black hole made of neutronium, which is really just a super dense neutron star, according to the theory of super relativity. So at the very beginning, when the big bomb went off, there was massive amounts of neutron gas and plasma, along with all the spheres of various sizes that form the galaxies, the stars, and the planets all throughout the universe. It's a perfect design. It's so sensible. Gas or plasma, within 15 minutes, becomes hydrogen, massive amounts of hydrogen, enough to build all the stars and planets we see today in our universe. It's a sensible, logical theory that I'm sure one day will be proven. But that's all in the book. I spent 3 chapters talking about the neutron and the cosmology theory of super relativity, and it all fits together nicely.
And whenever you were on last time, we were talking about things like this, Mark. The idea that this concept is not necessarily something new, just something that was not thought about by a lot of people. Even the concepts of relativity in and of itself, that took a crowbar and a hammer to get into the actual plying work of using it in science before people were like, yes, this is a thing. Yes, this is a thing. It was a great theory, but it was one of those, like, Einstein had that in a dream and woke up and wrote it down. Like that was one of those true moments of, quote, divine revelation, even as he would put it.
Yes.
And he spent the rest of his life working to prove and defend that theory of general relativity. Now, which is where you got obsessed as a kid. And even to the point I would say, not necessarily obsessed as a kid. You are, as a kid, obsessed now. That would be the great way to put it. Because it does take that mind of a child, that constant viewing of an aha moment to doggedly chase a concept like this.
I gathered great amounts of knowledge just by simply having an open mind and reading what the masters of the past did. Einstein, Lorentz, Maxwell, Faraday, and Newton primarily were my guides. I just read about their work, read about their ideas and theories, And I saw all the way through. They actually made sense and were very consistent. And then things broke in the year 1905 through a series of things that happened. Some of it had to do with Einstein and, of course, the famous Michelson and Morley experiment. Those two things, the special relativity coming right out afterwards, kind of steered science in the wrong direction, away from the ether, which is the foundational principle idea of the theory of superrelativity. And in my book, I have to work hard to make everyone realize that the ether does in fact exist. And the Michelson-Morley experiment was a flawed experiment. They did it, they executed it perfectly. There's nothing wrong with the measurements or anything. It's the design of the experiment was flawed. And then that led to a misinterpretation of the fact that the ether wind was not detected, or Earth's motion through absolute motion through the outer space was not detectable because of that, the way that experiment was done.
Yeah.
So I explain that in the book, and it's a little bit tedious, but when you get to it, you see, it could have never worked, and therefore the ether really does exist. It's not that, we didn't detect the ether wind, and since we didn't detect the ether wind, that proves the ether doesn't exist. No.
Yeah.
The ether does exist. What was wrong with that experiment was the light beam, the thing that we're using to measure the difference, was something that is always constant and cannot be changed. There it is right there. The interferometer.
Yes.
Interferometer. That's it. They were measuring, at right angles to see if there was going to be any difference in the speed of light, and they never could find it. So they abandoned the idea that the Earth or space was made of a fundamental field called the ether. And that mistake, a huge error in the metaphysics, the philosophy, and science at that time. And that's steered us away from classical physics and into quantum mechanics. And so we've been going further and further down the rabbit hole away from the truth. So I went through my book and I established much evidence in favor of the ether to get us back on track and get us back to discovering the unified field theory.
Well, and, with that in mind, just to hop back in the conversation a second, I think it's really pertinent because, as you said, it's utterly pertinent to the theory of superrelativity, the concept of the prime mover. And this goes back to an Aristotelian concept, folks. The Aristotle spoke about this. Of course, was a concept, as you were talking about, related to the ether that alchemists spoke about for years. It was for them, the ether was the constant.
There's really, according to theory of superrelativity, there's really only one thing that exists in this universe, and that's space, or the ether. Everything else is made from it. So particles, they're just structures or configurations of the ether, and I break down the three, the particle, the electrostatic field, which is a vortex or a twist of space. That's not a new concept. That was worked on back in Maxwell's time, and they were on the right track, but they can never work out the mechanics of how and why the particles were able to move. And so I had to discover that. That's the slip wave that is in my book that I talk about. I discovered the mechanical method used by particles like the photon to move through outer space at the speed of light. That's a pretty amazing trick for a particle, ultra small particle, to be able to maintain that ridiculously high speed through billions of miles, never slow down, never stop, Even when it hits something, it keeps going. And that's an amazing trick, because if we had to build a rocket to do that, it would take all of the energy of the universe to drive that rocket just up to the speed of light. But yet a photon does it effortlessly and perpetually. So I had to break down how that could be. And it's by its structure, basically, it creates a gradient field, a pressure wave, and within the particle. And so it's like a bubble, and it moves in a particular direction depending on how the structure is, way it's pointing. So it can move in any direction. So particles are basically pressure waves that are gradient fields, pressure waves that are basically zipping or slipping within the ether field, which is a homogeneous field out there, which works perfectly in this case, with the gradient field being inside of the particle.
Interesting.
And that's how that's so sensible. I don't know why it's taken so many years to figure that out. Basically, there's a flaw in physics. It's called kinematics, which is allowed them to proceed without working on this problem, which kinematics is the branch of mechanics concerned with the motion of objects without reference to the forces which cause the motion. They just ignored that the particles move, and they didn't know how. They just did the calculations without trying to figure that out. So in super relativity, I said particles move because there are pressure waves inside of them, all of them. And that then is linked to the rest of the theory that creates magnetism, and then the motion of electromagnetic fields, unbalanced charges in an accelerated manner, then creates the gravitational field. So I was able to unify electromagnetism and gravity will now emerge as aspects of a single fundamental field, which is the ether field. So it all makes sense. It's all logical, and it's all mechanical, just like Newton said. And Einstein was so close to getting before he died.
And, you know, that's one of those gentlemen, once again, worked doggedly their entire, once the theorem that they had, once the hypothesis became a theorem, there then had to be a proof for that. And once there was a proof for that, you literally spend the entire existence of that proof defending the proof.
Yeah, that's what I'm working on now.
Like
that's
that's quite literally how science works. So if you grasp that idea, you could see how, let's just say some scientists may be a little obstinate when it comes to perhaps bending to a new thought form, you know,
right?
When it comes to perhaps not even necessarily looking at things outside of the box, but considering the other objects in the box as causality.
Well, I have this to say about what you just said. It is a tragic occurrence that scientists can be blinded by their own presuppositions. That's the problem I face.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm going to have to figure out a way to overcome it. So I'm playing by their rules, and I'm making a paper just like you talked about, where I have the proof and the mathematical proof. I'm not a physicist, but I worked on the math. I hired a physicist to train me on this particular area, and I put the equations together myself, and I was able to do something that has never been done before. I was able to predict the mass of a particle, and without using quantum mechanics at all.
Wow.
And that's in the paper. Solid proof that goes with my theory that backs it up. It's the model that basically, in a nutshell, my theory is saying that gravity, the origin of mass and gravity, comes about of the accelerated motion of fundamental unbalanced charges. When particles move like that in an accelerated manner, they create a contraction of space. That contraction of space is the gravitational field. It's simple deformation or bending of the ether material caused by the accelerated motion of unbalanced charges. And basically, when I say that, it's circular motion or elliptical motion. That's a uniform accelerated motion, and that's what's required to create gravity. And Einstein said that. He said the equivalence principle. Somehow he realized, along with Newton, who's the first person to realize that acceleration has something to do with gravity. But neither one of them could do the mechanical part. That's the part I just described to you. The mechanical part is the contraction of space caused by acceleration of moving objects through that space. That's the final link that unifies the three forces of this world, gravity, magnetism, and the electrostatic force.
Wow. And, that really, especially whenever you start going into the principles of quantum mechanics, things like that, the idea of quantum entanglement immediately comes to mind whenever you're speaking about this. The idea that for every particle, there is a mirror particle doing the exact same thing somewhere. It could be nearby, it could be across the cosmos. But I mean, it was recently announced, and I mean, granted, the article that I found right here is from Science Daily from 2018. Quantum entanglement between two physically separated ultra-cold atomic clouds achieved. And now, that in and of itself was one of those moments where it was much like proving the speed of light, where it was like, yes, it's a constant. Does that mean it cannot be altered? Does that mean it cannot be, that the effect of that constant cannot be altered? No.
Yeah. In fact, in my book, I go through the constants. All are not going to be, they're going to be found not to be constant, including the speed of light.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's really interesting because another one that I brought up that I'm not sure that you're aware of, this was one that just came out not too long ago out of the BBC, talking about scientists have strong evidence for a new force of nature in muons. A new theory and proof talking about the current theory is subatomic physics and the way that these, once again, subatomic particles have almost a strange attraction to each other, like they want to be near each other. And it's interesting, even people like Stephen Hawking, before he died, came to the public announcement that the evidence for a prime mover, for some kind of grand design being there, is definitely there. The concept of intelligent design, like there's the odds of this happening are so astronomical that it's beyond astronomical. The odds of all of these things, because all of these things have to coexist for the cosmos to exist. Like,
everything.
Like, if you think that it's a delicate balance just here on Earth, folks, and 2 weeks of 100-degree days bring like 10 hours of dead fish washing up in Florida. Imagine that cosmically. Imagine that dance cosmically. That's what's happening. Well,
to back up what you just said, the whole thing about intelligent design, I'm thoroughly convinced that's the way it works. And so at some point, science and religion need to come together and work as one again. Because, how can I say this? Einstein once said, science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. The two should be working together because ultimately all of science comes from the creator. And there's proof of that if you were willing to take near-death experiences as evidence, which I certainly have very definitely considered. And there's one person, well, many people actually, but Father Rick Wendell has made it very clear when talking to God during his near-death experience, God tells him, I'm the creator of the universe. And he says, all of this three-dimensional world is within God. There is nothing outside of God. Everything within this physical universe has to correspond to laws, and God set those laws. They are immutable as God is immutable. None of this, what we see and experience, is an accident. It is intentioned by God. Time does not really exist. God is outside of time. We have perceptions of time in the physical world. That perception changes according to our circumstances.
Absolutely. Time is utterly relative to the observer. Time is utterly changeable, flexible, malleable. And I wish that more people would remembering that's kind of like remembering that America is a republic, not a democracy. People just tend to forget it.
Right.
And it leads down really, really bad roads. Like you have to remember that time is not a constant. We gave time the construct. We decided that it's 60 seconds to a minute, 24 hours to a day. Like, that's not a universal thing. Otherwise, a day would be the same length on Jupiter, on Mars, and on Earth.
Well, we gave a unit to an interval.
Yeah.
And where did the interval emerge from? The only reason we have time at all is because there's a real physical space. And if distance equals rate times time, if, as many physicists say, that outer space is a complete void made of nothing, which cannot be true. That means there would be no distance between objects. If there was nothing between us and the sun, truly nothing, it would take zero time for sunlight to reach Earth.
Yeah, it wouldn't take 8 minutes.
What happens? Once you have a true physical medium, it takes time to traverse that medium at any rate that you choose. So that's what we see in nature. That's what's always been proven to be true. It takes 8.5 minutes for the sunlight to reach to Earth. That's because there's really something in between the Earth and the sun, which is the ether or outer space. You call it whatever you want, the space-time continuum. Yeah. It's the same thing. If that wasn't there, then time would disappear.
Well, and, that brings me right back to our pre-show conversation, Mark, the conversation that I was having with the person. I looked it up a minute ago. It was actually the Texas MUFON group that I was having the conversation in with somebody who asked the honest question. Why is it that these objects that are traveling 10,000 miles an hour on tape and stuff like that, these UAPs and the Nimitz videos, how come you don't hear sonic booms going off? How come you don't hear the speed of sound being broken? And I was like, you have to understand, the speed of sound happens because of a compression wave that builds up in front of a physical object that is causing resistance. Even a pointed physical object, the point of an airplane cone, the tip, even that builds up pressure and builds up molecules and atoms in front of it of air, and eventually breaking through that meniscus of air is what causes of a sonic boom. And then again, when you pass the next barrier of sound, the next 1,600, correct me if I'm wrong, 1,620 miles an hour. It's been a long time since I did the calculation of the resonant frequency of a room, audio engineers. So forgive me. But however, if you're using exotic technologies, if you're using any kind of, as Jack Safarati puts it, any kind of electrogravitic technology, anything like that is literally, as you're saying, creating a slip wave where there's like an electromagnetic sheath around you that is repelling repelling, and not only repelling, but attracting at the same time. Repelling on one side, attracting on the other, you know, kind of moving this the same way as you would like a toy train with magnets moving in a hyperloop, you know? Same concept. You're using a pulling force on the front end and a repelling force on the back. And if you're doing that and moving the molecules of air around you, you now have no pressure waves. So you won't, by all laws of physics, have a sonic boom. By the same token, you would be moving particles of water around you. Much like that article that we read out earlier talking about the Nimitz pilot saying he saw a USO, underwater submerged object, or unidentified submerged object, you know? So same concept right there, right, Mark?
Well, it's similar. Jack and I don't quite agree on the whole theory.
And Jack may not agree with my interpretation of what he said. I may not be nailing it 100%. I am straight up layman pitching this out there.
He's definitely on the right track, but I specifically say what UFOs use is a very intense magnetic field, and it's a gradient field. So the magnetic field at the front of the ship isn't quite as strong as it is at the rear of the ship. So what you do is you create a gradient magnetic field, a bubble, and that gives you not only anti-gravity, but propulsion. Just like a bubble that's pushed from the bottom of the ocean up because of pressure.
Yep.
The pressure around the stronger pressure at the bottom of the ocean pushes the bubble up. Well, in the case of the UFOs and the slip wave, you have a pressure gradient at the beginning of the object, which is very intense magnetic field. And then the next coil, or the magnetic coil that's adjacent to the one in the front, it's got a stronger field. And then the next concentric ring coil has got a stronger field. And then the last one at the end of the UFO has the strongest field. That thing is going to be propelled forward is determined by the strength and the gradient field that is produced. Not only does that cancel gravity and give you propulsion, but the slip wave, in this particular case in the atmosphere, rarefies or moves the air away from the outer hull of the ship, so that there's basically a rarefied or almost a vacuum in the immediate area within, let's say an inch or so of the UFO or the UAP. So when that thing moves, the pressure wave can't be built up because it's almost like there's a vacuum thing there moving through space. And so the shock wave never happens.
It never has a chance to happen. There's nothing there.
So that's very similar to what Jack is saying, but I'm giving you the specific mechanism used, which is basically a magnetic field, and in a most likely case, it's a strobing field, because motion of the magnetic field enhances the anti-gravity effect and the propulsion effect. And I would love to get an oscilloscope with a coil of wire and the probes hooked up close to a UFO to see the waveform that's coming off of the UFO. I would bet it's a sawtooth or something of that nature. Electronics people will know what I'm talking about there. But I'm sure that they're using strobing magnetic fields in various sequences.
It would have to be a rotating magnetic field like that. Yeah, it would have to be something where,
especially for flying saucers, you would have a rotating field zipping around at maybe 60 or 100 cycles or 200 or whatever. And that's the hover mode, and then you can strobe it in different patterns to get change direction. And this stuff is instantaneous. This is when you're using a spatial bias drive, which is what I'm talking about. You can make turns, 90-degree turns instantaneously, and have no inertial problem because you're inside of a
That's right.
field. The field that the magnetic field generates is another field called the the inverse hyperbolic field. And basically, that's the anti-gravity field.
Yeah, and that
And
is
once you
once
generate
again
this,
relative
you
to the
cancel
observer.
inertia. Yeah, you cancel inertia when you are inside of this field. Because if you didn't do that and you made a right turn at 10,000 miles an hour, you'd be dead. And everything inside of that ship would be dead.
Yeah, it'd be a little gooey in there.
Cancel inertia.
It'd be a little gooey in that cockpit, just to say the least. You know,
it's a perfect field for doing what these aliens are doing. It handles all the problems that need to be handled.
Yeah. Yeah, and not just aliens, but UAPs. Granted, you know, because like Mike Turber said, like I say on the show regularly, I am a believer, heart of hearts, believer in life from beyond. Mark, heart of hearts believer, absolutely. But because I am such a believer, the burden of proof is massive for me.
Mm-hmm.
I refuse for the proof to be flimsy. I refuse for people's testimonies to not match as what is coming out little by little, like we talked about with Mike Turber last week with the pilots from the Nimitz, where people in the same cockpit don't even report the same amount of time happening. Which, hey, if you're present in this kind of field, absolutely. Once again, that time is relative to the observer, especially whenever in a magnetic field like that. So, yeah, somebody's 5 minutes could become 10, and that same 5 could become 3.5 for the same person 2 feet away. That time distortion could definitely happen when close enough to a strong enough magnetic field. However, even the disturbance of instruments, as they claim, now claim. That wasn't hugely brought out before, but it is now. Even that could be explained by massive magnetic force. However, to me, it's one of those that I don't think that is the case with what happened with the. I think if anything, we are looking at once again our technology. I don't think that this is something that is an alien craft that we are looking at. I am not denying that those exist. But I think that what we are looking at in the case of the Nimitz and everything else is utterly earthbound technology. Is it using this technology that you're speaking of? Any geometric, anti-gravitic fields? Things like that? Darn tootin'.
Well, there's no doubt that we have it in my mind.
Yeah. Oh, no, most definitely we have it. Man, like we were talking about China's hypersonic missiles like 8 years ago. Where the hell did we get hypersonic technology from? Suddenly you're hearing about it like every other day in the news. You know?
Yeah.
And that's the thing. The news is catching up to this, but the world of hypersonic and 10,000 plus miles an hour on the face of the earth has been happening physically in research programs for decades. Decades.
Yeah. There's a lot of problems if you don't use the slip wave, though. You get friction that was enormous, the heating problems.
Absolutely.
All these problems are solved if you use a spatial bias drive. All those problems are solved.
Well, and we have
jets or rockets. You got problems that really could blow up in your face.
Oh yeah, yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, and you know, there were you go out and you look at a lot of these close to hypersonic planes. You know, even back in the day. I'm 45 years old, folks, but good Lord, the SO-71 Blackbird was one of my favorite planes in the world. We had other planes other than that, but even that one was one of those that you could see wires and stuff inside of it, because whenever it started going its full speed at the altitude that it went at, the metal heated up and expanded. and filled those gaps. Things like that. Those were the forces that they were dealing with. And we now have craft all over the place that are going Mach 10 plus, that are going hypersonic speeds on the face of the earth, missiles, aircraft, all kinds of things. They were just talking about a hypersonic drone the other day. So, now, before we let you go, because we've got you for about another 5 minutes or so, before we connect with Dr. John Hall, let's get into that slip wave a little bit. I don't want you to tease that and us not talk about a slip wave before you go, because that was some of the most interesting reading in the final synoptic that you sent me for super relativity. So let's get into that slip wave concept real quick.
Yeah, the slip wave comes from studying how the photon moved. That's where I discovered the slip wave. And I realized that, particles are all twists of space, electrostatic field. And as that particle, the beginning of the twist starts, whenever you twist something in a medium, like let's say you take silly putty and you put it down on a comic book picture and you lift it up and you twist the silly putty, you'll see the picture, the image stretch as you twist it. Well, space does the same thing. It stretches as it's twisted. So the more you twist it, the greater the stretch, then you create a pressure gradient. So as you go down along the x-axis, as you're twisting in space, it's becoming less dense and the pressure is dropping. And so what happens is you create a bubble. So, and then with this bubble, this certain, egg-shaped bubble, I guess you'd call it, the beginning end is a little bit, slightly less dense than the atmosphere around it, or the ether. And then all the way on the other end, it's much less dense. And so you got a very strong pressure field. And that is what gives the thing motion. Pressure gives everything motion in this world. Pressure makes the winds blow, high and low pressure. Pressure makes the pistons move in an automobile. Pressure makes water move through a hose. Every instance
makes blood
in nature,
move through your body.
Yes, and every instance in nature, pressure is the cause of motion. So I determined that it must be pressure that causes particles to move. So with this model worked out in my mind, I realized that we could expand this, just like the Wright brothers used birds as an example, and Leonardo da Vinci used birds as an example how to fly and create lift. I say use nature again, use the particles that move perpetually by using this pressure wave technology. And create a spaceship or any type of ship that creates a pressure wave. And the device, the field that does this safely and efficiently is a magnetic field, because a magnetic field is a rotation of space caused by a reaction to a moving charge. Charge is a twist of space. When it moves through space, it causes the space around it to rotate. That's the magnetic field. And that's exactly what we're going to use in these starships. Because not only do you get the benefit of creating this pressure gradient field that causes anti-gravity, cancellation of gravity, cancellation of inertia, and propulsion, but it does something in deep space that nothing else does. It creates a situation where it reduces permittivity and permeability of free space. And when you do that, you can exceed the speed of light. That is a critical breakthrough I'm talking about. That we can make a starship that can go to the stars nearby us within a matter of minutes, because you can, once you reduce permittivity and permeability of free space, look up James Clerk Maxwell, who determined that speed of light is equal to 1 over the square root of permittivity times permeability. When you reduce those two things in space by stretching it, by making it thinner, you can change those constants They're not constant. And using a magnetic field to do that allows you to minimize those. And the more you shrink them, the faster you can go. And it's unlimited. You can reduce them to 0 if you want, which then would make the speed of light infinitely fast, which is, I don't recommend, is incredibly unsafe to travel at that speed. But this is how our friends, the UAPs, the extraterrestrials, are getting around and getting to other star systems, because they can do it in a matter of minutes.
Wow.
Because they can go 50,000 to 100,000 times or more the speed of light. And that's what you have to do in order to be interstellar travelers.
And you know, it's interesting because I was bringing up, and I know you probably just saw it, all the optical pumping data. A lot of people don't realize that a laser, light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation. And note, I was not looking at a screen when I said that. That's what kind of nerd I am. I know what laser stands for, folks. But they are called optical pumps. And I'll bring it back up. The whole reason is because the idea is that you're basically bouncing the photons of light from a strobe through a medium. And that medium is ruby, a gas even. You can do it through a gas, neon argon lasers, all that kind of stuff. That's normally what you see at planetariums, that kind of stuff, folks. Helium neon lasers, that kind of thing. It gives you a blue-green light. And man, just the idea that lasers themselves are quite literally where you take a medium, put it in the middle of a fully reflective surface like a tube, and then flash photons through it. And those photons, through going through that medium and bouncing around to it, all attain the same frequency, which means that they attain the same intensity, which means that they shoot out through the partially reflective mirror on the other side as a coherent form of light in one color instead of the white light of all bands that they started out with. And that frequency is defined by whatever medium you're putting it through and the frequency that is, be it ruby, quartz, what have you. So even if you were using plasmas and high energy fields to create a laser energy effect around a craft through metamaterials, what have you, you would literally...
Very good, very good. I want to compliment you on bringing up metamaterials.
Like you would literally be using the craft itself as a laser medium. You would be using light through the metamaterial around the craft to create a laser medium, thereby optically pumping it and making it more coherent. Just the same way that the medium would act and make the atoms coherent coming out in a laser instead of being scattered as white light.
Well, metamaterials has been proven to metamaterials they use to tune the properties of permittivity and permeability.
Yeah.
And you've done research. I'm very impressed by this.
Well, and I mean, granted, I talk about metamaterials regularly on the show. I used to work conferences regularly, Mark, where the people making metamaterials who were up on my stage, like giving presentations, that kind of stuff. But to know that metamaterials are nothing more than wafers of lattices of material, that is no different than the same way that you build a semiconductor, the same way that you build an LED, the same way that you build an infrared or semiconducting laser. So once again, we're coming back to that concept of optically pumping and using light and things like that and the gases around the object to literally be able to change the way that the object interacts with the environment around it. Just a concept that I'm throwing out there. I'm not saying that's anywhere than what just dawned on me with the concept of optical pumping and what you were talking about in your work, super relativity over here as you were describing it.
Yeah, we're not just optically pumping things, we're materially pumping everything that's within that bubble.
Wow.
and on a large scale. So the whole spaceship can be moved at any desired speed, the speed of a god, basically.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm trying to push. That's why this book was written primarily, is to get us into the anti-gravity technology and be able to get us off this planet if we need to get off this planet because something goes wrong.
That's just it. If you had that craft vibrating at the same frequency as light, you aren't affected by anything.
Well,
phenomenal.
It's within our reach, and I think our government has already reverse engineered UFOs from many years ago, and probably
that I
well
hold.
away.
Sure.
But I want to see this for everyone in the world, not just the United States government, and it's time for this to come out.
Absolutely.
You're helping do that by putting on shows like this and talking about this stuff and getting that information out there. We're setting another beacon out, and hopefully we'll contact the right people eventually.
Well, as we spoke about in our last episode with you, Mark, it is all about that force of intention in the universe, and that mastering of reality and understanding the reality around you and your place in the reality around you, and the fact that you yourself, me, you, Mark, despite our distance, are sharing an electron shell by all means of physics.
Yes.
Like we are literally sitting in the same room despite all distance and time. And that's the physics of it. And once you understand that, none of this is impossible or science fiction. Not a lick of it. Before we let you go, Mark, one last time for shameless self-promotion. Let everybody know where they can go to get your book, Master of Reality, other than Dudes and Beer and CuriousWealth.com. Where they can go to get that, where they can go to find out more about the concept of super relativity.
Sure. My website is www.super-relativity.com. And on the very front page, I have links. There it is, right there, to view the book trailer, book sales on Amazon, paperback and Kindle, and you can buy a signed book off of my site. I just ordered 2 more boxes of books because I'm running low. So there's multiple places to get the book right now, and they're in stock and ready to go.
Well, I will definitely be talking to you about getting a signed copy because I have loved my digital copy, and have even purchased a couple of the digital copies from Amazon Kindle for friends, things like that. So that's honestly one of my favorite things about the Kindle service and people making books available via Kindle is the utter affordability of them and availability to share them like that, to just buy them and send them to somebody's email address.
That's nice.
It's really cool to just be like, man, I will spend $5.99 on this all day long and send it to somebody. Just to make a light bulb go on somewhere in the world with somebody that counts. Not that they don't all count, but there are some people where it's like, this person needs to hear this. And yours is one of those, along with Dean Radin's Real Magic, things like that. And even our next guest, who we're about to get on right after we let you go, John Hall, author of Guinea Pigs, Technologies of Control. He's another one that I've sent copies of books to people because it's like, if you haven't read this, you need to. So once again, super-relativity.com is where you can go to get the book, Master of Reality, folks. Go check that out. Mark Fiorentino, thank you so much again for coming on. I greatly appreciate your time with us this evening.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
You bet, my friend. We will talk to you soon. You take care and have a great evening.
Okay, you too.
All right, bye-bye. And, just the idea, like we were showing on there a second ago, folks, of the technology that exists, even the theorems that he is putting out, the hypotheses, not theorems, hypotheses come first, the hypotheses that he is putting out there about this kind of stuff. And speaking of hypotheses, everybody, The video that I am about to play comes to you courtesy of the Dudes and Beer podcast. Myself and Dr. John Hall. These are it's a little collection of clips from us from a Dudes and Beer Called It Real regarding COVID-19 and the sources. And right after that, I'm going to play another clip before we bring Dr. John Hall that is just mind-numbing. Here recently, there was a House panel that happened. Let me bring it up. It was actually a House Select Committee on the origins of the coronavirus. And I'm here to tell you, folks, feel free to look it up. Feel free to Google it. We'll be Googling it on screen. See what you can find. The video that I'll be playing tonight is off of Forbes. I ran across it as it was happening a couple weeks ago. And me and John Hall is who we have been covering the story of COVID and its origins with. Scientifically, so I definitely wanted to have him on, and he was not available. My schedule conflicted, his schedule conflicted. We decided on tonight was available, and I went through and listened to 3 hours of it again today, and you can ask my wife, man, I was livid for like 2 hours before this show after listening to this again, because they knew and they let it happen, and it's horrifying. The facts of the case are more than science fiction. They're crazy. This part of the show is the trigger warning that I was telling you about, folks. Here is the clip from Dr. John Hall and I from past episodes of the Dudes and Beer podcast dating back over a year ago. With the concept of it being similar to the common cold and also being a flu, these are things that mutate regularly. And I think that's really a lot of the concern right now is the mutation factor. And, you know, by the time that we do begin to come up with some kind of vaccine, it will have mutated already.
Well, and you got to remember, too, that I think they've pretty well narrowed it down that it is a bat virus. And, you know, there's another really horrible virus called Hendra that comes from the bats, too, that they've been working with in BLS-4 laboratories. But there were no bats being sold at the Wuhan market, the wet market. But they were experimenting on bats at the Wuhan virology lab. Not that it was weaponized, but it may have been an accidental release from there, because it had to get from the animal host to a human host, and the first death was someone who hadn't been to the Wuhan market. But you have to have as close as you can to the initial, virus DNA component that initially affected humans, because, as you said, it can mutate. It mutates when it goes to an animal host or a human host, and it can mutate again as it goes from human to human host. So far, they're saying that they think the mutations have stabilized, but like we said, what the mutation you see in Italy may be different from when you see in this country. It may be different mutations in between cultural groups, or ethnic groups. So that's the thing to watch out. Viruses are pretty smart little devils. Viruses and prions are really about the smallest thing we have that can be considered a living.
Yeah.
And they're good. And we work with them here to weaponize them, as well as other countries too. As far as the theories that possibly it's a weaponized virus, I can't say that it was really weaponized. I can say that they were doing research on that coronavirus from those bats in Wuhan. They do have the bats there.
Absolutely.
And there were scientists there that were actually doing research to figure out ways for that virus to bind irreversibly to lung protein to make it more virulent. Is it possible that it was a weaponized form of it that somehow escaped that lab? Yes. You're always a little suspect whenever you see a zoonotic virus that's never been seen in human transmission before.
Yeah.
all of a sudden become human transmission. Now, yes, they do have a virology lab that, like we have them here too, that their job is to investigate these viruses, not only for treatment and prevention in case they ever do get into the human population, but they're also used militarily to weaponize viruses.
Sure.
So the fact that one of these viruses jumped from a bat to one person in the Wuhan, China area where there happens to be a virology lab, at the risk of sounding conspiratorial, it sounds like probably that was possibly a manipulated virus to me.
And ladies and gentlemen, those are quite literally the words of our exact government panel that just happened. Before we get into all that, Dr. John Hall, welcome back to the show. How are you doing, my good friend?
Doing great, Chris. I was listening to your show prior to coming on. Oh my gosh, what a great guest with Mark Fiorentino.
Dude, isn't he
very
awesome?
Interesting topic.
Like,
I feel like coming on. I feel like coming on and just saying, thank you, listeners. I'm John Hall. Have a good night.
Yeah. Just drop the mic while you can and walk off.
Yeah.
Yeah, what he said. See you later.
Yeah.
But the thing is, John, we have been, good God, man, that was episode 258. That audio was from 258. We are now beyond three. We're closing down at 350, not closing down, transforming at 350. We are now at 330. That is over a year ago. That is 80 episodes ago, almost. We do an episode a week.
It. And we were pretty accurate on that. I have a lot of other physicians and people that work with me that have asked me my opinion on that. And what I tell them is I live literally, as the crow flies, less than a quarter of a mile from the second largest American continent, Bracken Bat Cave. And there's literally bats flying around my fields around here at the farm all the time. As a matter of fact, one of the little things I like to do is I'll go out and throw pebbles up in the air, and they catch them on their sonar, and they'll chase the pebbles right down to the ground in front of me. And we have them, we'll catch them, roosting around the overhang of the house and stuff. I've literally had bats around me for 20 years now, and I've never caught a bat virus that I've given to the rest of the planet.
Yeah.
So
I used to play with free-tail bats all the time as a kid. Not like play with them, handle them, but do the same thing, Throw a pine cone up in the air and they'll follow it like within inches of you. And hey, on a good mosquito night, on a good mosquito dark night with the street light, they'll just come like within inches of you, just snatching mosquitoes. And quite literally, there are so many of them between Austin and San Antonio, right outside San Antonio where you live, like you said, the Bracken colony right out there, that whenever those two colonies conjoin, the airports and weather systems have to be alerted because it appears as an air mass on screen. It just appears as a huge mass on radar maps because of where they sit feeding on the insects in the air.
And something your listeners may not know is Bracken Bat Cave has an observation area.
Yep.
So there are literally thousands of people a year. They limit the number of tickets you can get through Bat Conservation International, BCI. Great organization, by the way. And but you can go and sit. Now, it's probably a couple of 100 feet away from this cave, and literally millions of bats come out of that cave every night to go looking for bugs. And it's kind of neat because hawks and owls sit around and wait to pick bats off as they fly out of the cave. But I mean, tons of people are exposed to bat viruses that are in the air as those things fly out and vapors of their guano come out of that cave. And there's never been a hop from one of those bat viruses to a human.
Yeah. And that was something that was brought up numerous times in this House Select Committee. I'm going to play, and granted, folks, you've already heard, we're going to talk as well, Dr. John Hall, but tonight is really very much with you being on about this, very much a Dudes and Beer Called It episode. about this, because this is something that, man, I know you had things stopped from Facebook. I know the Dudes and Beer group had things stopped from Facebook that I shared saying, like, this is all kinds of stuff. Like, I'm not a crazy person. I showed them to Amy where it's like, hey, this is a hypothesis, folks. And I'm sorry if you don't agree with the scientific process. But the concept of a hypothesis is, let's throw an idea out there no matter how crazy it is. Now, the concept of a theory is to prove or disprove the hypothesis. That's welcome to science, you know? So the idea is that you should be allowed to theorize anything, right? And that's what we kept saying, was that it seems like this is a virus that was more than just accidental as far as crossing over. It didn't just cross over. And as we'll hear from people tonight, because I'll be playing some of this jaw-dropping testimony, and like I said, I'll pull it up on screen right now. Let's look up House Select Panel on coronavirus source. I will Google that because I am confident that it will not pop up more than a whole bunch of stuff. Like when I ran across that Forbes video, I snatched it. I recorded it on Facebook, and then I went and downloaded it immediately on YouTube because that was the source. I went to the source, and right after it stopped and published, I downloaded it just in case. But I was screen capturing the whole 3 hours, Doc. And it was like, but it disgusted me.
And that's another can of worms too, is that, you know, everybody was worried about the military-industrial complex, and really the problem we have is the government social media complex, because the social media platforms are actually doing the government's bidding, and you're only going to get the information that you're allowed to get.
Yep.
And it's funny how those Facebook warnings always come up misinformation, because misinformation isn't false information. And the listeners need to be clear on that. If it was false information, it would say false information. Misinformation just means it's information that the government doesn't agree with or social media doesn't agree with you knowing. It doesn't mean it's not true.
No. Yeah. And just so my watchers know out there, not just capital W watchers, you know what I mean, Doc? But those out there on Facebook, YouTube, stuff like that, even the people that tune in on the posts afterward, the reason I paused on this Google search screen is because this computer has never, ever, ever looked up the topic that we are looking up. And in theory, if it was out there in a lot of places talking about the House Select Panel on coronavirus origins, it would pop up. But we have unintimate lives. Let's take it a step further. Coronavirus vaccine, no origins. No, and it even corrected my coronavirus. You like that? But in cats or dogs, there's a House Select Panel on coronavirus or cats or dogs, but not origins. And whenever we hit enter, let's see what's there. There's the expert witnesses, everything else. And it's fantastic. It's amazing to see that it takes you completing that even to find it. But to find the video was almost impossible afterward. And the video that I'm about to play from Dr. David Asher, who was part of the intelligence department. He was actively on the Defense Department panel for bioweapons, things like that. This is about a 3.5-minute clip. And the clips that we'll be playing from the doctors tonight are quite literally what they lay out as the facts of the case. Now, granted, this was supposed to be a bipartisan committee in the House. Democrats were invited to come be a part of it. Nobody decided to come take part but Republicans. I am as purple as you get, folks, but I'm just saying that's kind of weird. Especially since the bill for the origins of the coronavirus and to have a panel on it passed unanimously in the Senate. Like one of the only bills to pass with almost 100%. But it hadn't been taken up in the House. And when the panel was put forth to happen, Only these guys showed up, and it should actually disgust everybody to know that this is the panel that's happening, and this is the empty room that it happened in. Here's that first clip right now, Doc, from Dr. David Asher, talking about how China publicly admitted to having a bioweapons program in 2017.
Did we actually know and not process the data? And that's, something we can fix. It's not that we can't expect the intel fairy to exist on the policymaker's desk and say, oh, what do you want to know today? But certainly at State Department, we would have liked to have known that the Chinese were working on the types of research we later learned they were in the possession of our government while this was happening.
Well,
so we might have known, but didn't actually know. You understand? It's a weird thing, like with pre-9/11 information.
Well, I'm going to take it a little broader, but you're sort of getting to the point I wanted to make is Dr. Fauci was on notice on February 1st. Actually, take that back. He was on notice on January 31st. We got the email where one of the scientists who gets American tax dollars sent him the email and says, the unusual features of the virus make up a really small part of the genome, so one has to look really closely at all the sequences to see that some of the features look engineered. So the top guy on this in our government, the spokesman for the past year and a half, knew clear back on January 31st, 2020, and he also knew this sentence. We all find the genome inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory. So we were on notice back on January 31st, but I think the guy who had this and was on notice downplayed it and actually manufactured an article to keep the American people from knowing this.
Well, we were on notice in February of 2017 when the French government that had the most sophisticated technology employed in the world, they gave to the Wuhan Institute, were kicked out and told the world that they thought this might be the beginning of a WMD program. So now that didn't mean the President of the United States or anyone really knew about it, but those of us following the technology knew about it.
But that's different. That is
it's a little different, but
it's a lot different because this is a guy in our government who gave
Dr.
the very
Fauci
grants
should
who's
have
now
known
on
about
notice.
it too, shouldn't he? I mean, it's his counterpart in France. They were supposed to have 50 of their researchers from his French counterpart on station, and they were evicted.
Dr. Ash, let me ask you a question. Earlier today, you talked about this came from the lab, and the question is it just a leak from the lab, or is it a bioweapon? And I want you to talk to us about that, because I think the assumption for most of us has been it's a leak from the lab, but you're the one who raised the bioweapon. You brought up that term, and you've been at the State Department. I think you were at the State Department for over 25 years.
In and out.
In and out, educated at Oxford and Cornell. You know a little something about all this stuff. Tell me your answer to, was it just a lab leak or was it a bioweapon?
They were working on a program related to synthetic biology and gain of function using the serial passage evolutionary or convolutionary technology approaches. Quite publicly, actually, that they had said in their 2011 Declaration of the Biological Weapons Convention and other places, including speeches by their generals, was related to their future of warfare, of hybrid warfare. So, of course, they were working on dual-use research of concern. It's called DIRC. And the DIRC, in this case, again, if it gets out of a lab and it's not contained promptly, could result in a weapons-like release. Okay, whether they deliberately did it is, I have very little sense they did. But were they deliberately working on developing the capability to use advanced pathogenetic capabilities of war in a way that no one's seen ever employed? Yeah, they were. Of course they are. That's what the Chinese have been talking about publicly. So, I mean, there shouldn't be any surprise here. I just don't know why no one paid attention to it.
And there you have it. I wish I had I wish I had a slam dunk sound or like a video clip of somebody breaking a backboard, Doc. Because Dirk is about all I can say.
Well, and if you remember on one of our shows, a year ago, you were kind of to be somewhat politically correct. As a scientist and a physician, you're kind of bound to say, well, maybe it was an accidental leak, but
sure.
Once a little more information came out, and we were a little further along in the pandemic, I think actually on your show, or one of the other shows I did, but I think it was your show. I actually mentioned that to me, this kind of looked like a beta test.
Yes.
This looked like they were able to manipulate a virus to have some fatality to it and effective enough that it would send people to the doctor to get tested, and maybe kill some elderly people and some people with weak immune systems. But that would be the only way that a government that's looking to actually eventually release a truly massively fatal virus, the only way you would be able to get information on its distribution would be to release a virus first as a beta test that makes people sick enough to seek treatment, because it's the seeking treatment and the getting tested and all of that actually would give the Chinese government back data to determine how well the release went. And even the Italian government came out and said that they don't think that it came to Italy on person-to-person transmission. They think it came to Italy on substrate, on products that were being imported from China. And I think we had even kind of talked about that a little bit on one of your earlier shows too, that it spread too fast to go from person to person. Even if they sent 100 people that were infected from Wuhan to New York City, and then all of a sudden every state had, a million people infected, that's pretty quick for a pandemic.
Yeah. And that, like I said, I don't know if you had a chance to listen to the whole 3-hour panel or not, Doctor, but there are a couple clips tonight that are a little long, like 7 minutes in length, but we got to listen to them because they are literally these professionals in the world of pandemic and virology talking about the 6 points that show that this was not necessarily created in a lab, but definitely manipulated in a lab from an original host organism to be more virulent and hit people more. And not only just be more virulent and hit people more, but be more virulent, attached to the protein bond faster, and also be asymptomatic. Like that is testified to in here.
On our first show about this, I told you, and I believe I actually sent you the early study regarding that showed exactly that they did manipulate that virus to be able to those spike proteins to actually bind to human protein. That virus would have never infected a human being, even if you had swallowed the bat that had it.
And that's just it. The evidence that they show in this hearing, man, go into showing that they tested into like 90,000 species, like 90,000 different animals locally, not species, but animals locally, and found no presence. No presence.
Well, and that virus came from one particular species of bat, too.
Yeah.
That's not a virus that's common among every species of bat. That came from a horseshoe bat from one cave in southwest China.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. And,
and I think it's like I mentioned on your show before, if you're going to, there's a real fine line between gain-of-function research being done to protect humans from a zoonotic virus and gain-of-function research being done to weaponize a virus. I mean, the line is hair thin, because gain-of-function research to make a virus more virulent to humans for any reason is technically weapons research.
We will show the clip later where they actively talk about the Chinese government talking about viruses that might be able to target ethnopopulations.
And I think I posted actually that study on my guinea pigs Facebook page.
Yes, you did. I shared it to the Dudes and Beer page.
Yeah, that goes through all of that. Yeah, I think that study came out in 14 or 13. I mean, it was years ago where they mentioned actually being able to target particular ethnic groups through viral gain-of-function research. Well, if you were doing gain-of-function research really to protect humans from zoonotic viruses, you'd be doing it on cats and dogs and cows and horses.
Exactly.
Animals that we're around every day. And not a horseshoe bat from one cave in southwest China that no one else other than the people that live in that area are ever going to be around.
Yeah. Yeah, precisely. And with that in mind, here's our next clip, folks, which is Dr. Stephen Quay. Let me make sure that's the one I have selected here. No, Dr. Gerard, actually, which Dr. Gerard, once again, all these guys had positions in government, stuff like that. Dr. Quay, who we'll hear the 6 points from later, has like, I forget how many hundreds of patents in the medical field to his name. Like, these are all people that are well renowned in their field. This is the clip from Dr. Gerard talking about evidence of interferon blocking in the genetic manipulation through gain of function to literally make it not only more virulent and more easily attachable to the human protein, but the spike protein, but also to make it asymptomatic, to make it spread even worse.
If we had known it was from the lab, and as Dr. Muller points out, engineered, I think you said earlier, Dr. Gerard, that would have helped us save lives. Is that true?
I do believe that. Two answers, whether it was engineered or not, if we would have known early and there wasn't a cover-up, we could have saved lives. Number two, if we knew it was lab-derived and they were transparent, again, I'm just hearing about the ORF7 interferon right here, but that is such a key issue, which tells you if you get fever and get sick because of your interferon response, and if it was deliberately engineered to block that, not only does that become more infectious, but it means you're going to be asymptomatic.
Yeah.
That could have been a major important finding for us to know early if that were true.
Sorry about that. Once again, just mind-numbing information there from literally a government panel. And once again, when you look at the image, an empty room. An empty room this is happening in. So that's exactly what's going on with all of what we should be having as truth behind this fact right now. And to know that we knew almost a year ago that there was genetic manipulation going on, that this spike protein that they're talking about was there, and that wasn't put forth, nobody has been called to task on it, is pretty phenomenal after the massive loss of life that we have had.
Well, and the truth is that we had some investment in that, and there were people within government, Fauci and Peter Daszak, that knew damn well that they were weaponizing viruses there, and knew when this happened that this was a weaponized virus that was being affected on us and being dispersed on us. Now, what we need to really dig and find out is just put it to rest that this was a manipulated virus, and then put it to rest that it was probably intentionally disseminated, and actually determine the mode of dissemination, because that's going to be the only thing that saves us from the next one, is knowing how they got this one out so fast to spread. Because if you look at this as a beta test for a future possibly more fatal virus, and remember the communist Chinese do want to be the world power, and we unfortunately live in a society in America now where the Chinese interest in our social media and in our political institutions and everything is heavily financed through China.
Yeah.
Even like you mentioned, Forbes magazine. Forbes magazine is mostly owned by Chinese interests now. Forbes family really doesn't have anything to do with it anymore. Comcast has a heavy financial hand in most of our major media, MSNBC, CBS, CNN. And then you have Google, Facebook, Twitter, that are all trying to market themselves in China, to make the big bucks with the billions of people that live there. So they're not going to allow anything to come out that puts China in a bad light. Neither is our major media. And to some extent, the Democratic Party. Not some of the Republicans obviously are probably being financed by Chinese too. But when you see one of our Democratic House senators actually in an affair with a Chinese spy, And the media really didn't cover it, and he didn't suffer any ill effects from the pictures that were shown with him, and for the year or two that he spent with her. It kind of goes to show you what a bad way we are in as the American public, because we're only allowed to see and share what we're allowed to see and share anymore. There is no independent media source.
Yeah.
You know, even your show, you're going to be dependent on Amazon Web Services or, you know, somebody to be able to get your show out. And when they decide they don't want it out there, you'll go the way of Alex Jones.
Yeah. Which, I mean, granted, thank God, much like him, I have my own URL. I am working to the fact of having my own server, but I have to have a static IP address in order to do that properly. But that is how he maintains.
It'll come a time when the only way you're going to be able to listen to independent thought and possibly get to the truth will be kind of the way Rush Limbaugh started. It'll be shortwave.
Yeah,
I mean, you'll just have to broadcast on shortwave and try to reach as many people as you can.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because I have considered putting a shortwave transmitter in my rig here to have the show going out via shortwave. And it's funny that you say that. I am actively looking for, here is the clip right now. And granted, once again, I don't do a lot of clip shows, mainly because, well, as a producer, I find them lazy. But most of the time, clip shows are like, here's an old show from 1982. Enjoy. That is not what this is. This is me taking 3 hours of a panel and breaking it up into short, like 5-minute snippets. Please feel free. Go find the whole panel. It was put out by Forbes. You can find it online. But here is the clip right now of Dr. Gerard talking about how the Chinese government actively had veto power not only over the scientists on the investigative panel, but had prior access to the report released and veto power over the information released in said report. Check that out, folks.
One last example of the WHO. In April of 2021, the WHO released an entirely one-sided report which tried to examine the origins of the virus. Outside scientists were given little access, and the CCP was given full power to edit and alter the final report. Dr. Gerard, did the U.S. submit any names to be a part of the investigation team?
Yes, of the recent one, and I'm glad you bring this up because I want to emphasize that we submitted, and that went through my office, 3 non-political career scientists with impeccable credentials who could not be tied to anything that would be offensive to the Chinese, aside from they were going to seek the truth and find it. We don't know what happened to them, but all we know is they never showed up, and only Dr. Dasek was allowed to be on that committee. We heard that, we couldn't believe it, because it's just, I don't know if it's unprecedented, but it's pretty unprecedented that the Director General asks for us to submit names. We submit names, go out of our way to make sure they're completely apolitical, top-notch, and they're summarily rejected.
So did Communist China veto those names?
We infer that, but we don't know that. All we know is they had veto power, and these 3 names didn't show up.
But there were no Americans on this team.
Well, Peter Dasek was the
one American.
That's correct.
And Mr. Dasek, did he have a relationship with the Wuhan lab?
Of course, and that's well known.
That is a conflict of interest, correct?
It's a very it's an extreme conflict of interest. Again, I don't know him personally. I don't want to imply, but a priori there's a major conflict of interest there, since his organization was the vehicle to provide much funding to the Wuhan lab, and of course would have every reason in the world to make it not so that work that he funded actually caused a worldwide pandemic. Again, I don't speak for him, I don't know, but that's an appearance of a conflict of interest, which is why we had independent scientists who were not involved, FDA, CDC, NIH, we gave them the pick your agency you want, and they were impeccable and they were rejected.
Based just on these answers today, concerning the WHO and their behavior towards the United States and their favoritism towards China. It's very disappointing that President Biden rejoined the WHO as one of his first acts as president. Very disappointing without holding them accountable, without asking any questions, without demanding any transparency. Very, very disappointing. Mr. Ranking Member, I yield back.
Thank you. Now let's go back to Mr. Jordan for a second.
Absolutely wild stuff, man. Once again, to hear the fact that they fully had veto power over who was on that committee. Whether or not they exercised it, they don't know, but they know that they had the veto power. And that's just mind-numbing. It's, it's kind of like whenever we talk with Mitchell Gerber about the cases of Chinese organ harvesting, where the UN has gone in and independent inspectors have gone in, and they're like, this is no rumor, it's happening. How the hell is China still on a human rights panel in the UN if we know that's the case?
Well, and if you remember, the minute that a lot of us physicians started coming out going, you know what, this doesn't make sense.
Yep.
There's no way this hopped from a bat to man and became a pandemic. There's just no way that physically could have happened. And even your most basic physician can figure that out. We're used to seeing flus and, colds and stuff go around. And this was something so vastly different and so working so differently in the human body that it had to be a manipulated virus. Well, immediately when people started voicing that, if you remember, Peter Daszak actually found a handful of other basically scientific horrors that he could find to actually come out with that paper saying that they agreed that there's no way that this was manipulated in the lab, that it was a natural skip from an animal host to a human host, and that anything suggesting that it came from the lab was conspiratorial.
Yep.
And that was just an absolute published lie. And as a matter of fact, most of those scientists that signed off on that letter, I think it was published in The Lancet in Britain. Actually, most of those people, they can't even be found for comment. Now they know they lied.
And they actually referenced that exact article in this panel, saying that it's one of the most looked up articles. It was one of the most referenced articles in mainstream media. It was one of the most respected and referenced articles in social media. But there is no scientific basis to it, and it is horribly, horribly done. And the clip that I'm about to play right now from Dr. Richard Muller is him talking about, it's about 37, 45 seconds, but it's about him saying that he has never seen scientific evidence greater than the fact that this has been tampered with in a lab. Wild stuff.
Say that that the evidence that this was created by manipulation, by gene splicing, as well as gain of function, is compelling and beyond reasonable doubt. The scientific evidence is very strong, remarkably strong,
So
stronger than anything.
You think it's engineered?
Engineered.
Okay.
Yeah. Basically, I have been involved in many scientific discoveries, and I have never seen such compelling evidence, even for those scientific discoveries.
That's where I was at.
In physics.
All right, Dr. Asher.
That's just amazing to hear a physicist with, once again, numerous credos to his name, Doctor, say that I've been a part of numerous scientific discoveries, and never once have I seen something where there is such overwhelming evidence. And that's even being like a part of the scientific discovery. That's mind-numbing to think about, the fact that there is more than overwhelming evidence that this was definitely tinkered with in a lab to make it be able to be usable from animal to human. And they go through it numerous times. There's like a 9-minute clip that I have that I'm loath to play, but good God, it's some of the most bomb 9 minutes in the world coming from Dr. Stephen Quay, talking about the fact that the only way you can achieve this in a lab is by virally manipulating mice who have been humanized. And granted, that's mice with human genes in them. And you hear about it regularly. We post articles about it all the time. Mice genetically bred with human genes in them so that they can test medicines, things like that, without testing them on humans. But yet still testing them genetically to see what happens. And by using these mice, they literally coax the virus into a point where, as it replicates, it gets to where it kills more and more of this genetically engineered colony of mice, to the point where the majority of hosts it comes in contact with, it's virulently deathly too.
Well, and that's the kind of the dreaded thing that we have going on right now. So now we've pretty much come to the conclusion that this is a weaponized virus, and it was released one way or another to cause a pandemic. But now we're also being mandated to take a vaccine to allegedly protect us from the virus that was never tested on animals, wasn't FDA cleared. We are the test animals on the vaccine, with no certainty that it's going to, I mean, I can actually probably tell you with a lot of certainty that it's not going to protect you from the next virus that gets manipulated and released, because that's just not the way the game is played. And what's more troubling now is that the NSA is actually scanning your text messages and your emails to see if you're spreading misinformation to people about, whether or not to get the vaccine. That started today.
Wow. Yeah. And I would not doubt that one bit. I would not imagine that they wouldn't be doing that. The whole time I have held the fact that, yes, I can expect the fact that as a TSA pre-check person, they will probably be asking me my vaccination status.
And that's what the government has decided that they're going to do, is rather than the government mandate that you have a vaccination card, they're going to basically force companies to do it, private companies. So, and that's kind of the problem that we have now. That all of our social media, all of our, airline companies and things are going to be doing the dirty work for the government. So, I mean, in order to travel, in order to fly, in order to say anything on social media, you're going to have to pull the government line.
Well, and I have up right now the Real ID, and there are still a few states that are, check it out, folks. See if you're in a state whose driver's license does not comply with the proper holograms and micro images and things like that. But there are still numerous states, I think about 7 or 8. And when it comes to like within the continental airline flight, that's huge. Like when you're talking out of 50 continental states, like 8 of them do not comply with this, that's huge. That's a large amount of people that do not comply with the regulation on ID appearance and everything else, the way that the federal government says that it should for proper airline flight. And that's just the Real ID law that goes into effect fully May 3rd, 2023, about a year from now, folks, or 2 years from now, folks. So if you think that attached to that, and that means that there is a universal barcode on the back of your ID that can be scanned in any state, so that you could like, hey, Dr. John Hall, we could go to like Wisconsin, and they could scan the back of our ID, and we could buy a firearm in Wisconsin in our 5-day stay, things like that. So it would give them universal access to a database. And at that point, if it's like, hey, scan your ID, or we take your ID number and enter into a database whenever you get vaccinated, at that point, it's automatic. It's attached to your state-issued identification that you have been updated with your vaccination record. That is not an incredible leap of logic.
Well, and it should have told you something straight away, that as soon as they started thinking about mandating vaccines, or whether it's mandated through private businesses and your work, but as soon as they started talking about mandating the vaccine, if you notice, the FBI pulled out all the stops to make sure and shut down any fake vaccination cards being put. As a matter of fact, they just arrested a guy in California for printing up fake vaccine cards. The FBI stopped at nothing to pass laws immediately, or get laws passed immediately, to make that a felony to have a false vaccine card.
Sure.
But they can have 100,000 illegal immigrants coming across the border, and they don't bat an eye to do anything about it. So, I mean, there's a reason that they want people to be vaccinated. And if you think it's because the government cares whether you live or die, you better have your head examined. Because the government doesn't care if you.
Yeah, ask any family member of a Tuskegee Airman how much they care.
Yeah.
They'll let you know. And granted, I am no anti-vaxxer. That is not saying don't go out and get vaccinated, folks. I've had my shots. I am vaccinated. I know full well, like I said, it will more than likely be the case within the next year. I think this is just what I'm calling. And we've been prone to call things here on this show. We've been prone to be pretty decently right, John Hall, you and I. I would say that within the next 6 months to a year, we will hear some kind of relation to your vaccination record and your ID, state-wise. Yeah. We already have states like Massachusetts, things like that, where if you can't prove a vaccination record, you aren't getting in.
Now, the one thing one way to fight that would be for whoever out there is listening or listening to the show on a recording, you need to gather up as many of your friends as you can in your state and go to your state legislature and say, you know what, there's a bunch of us that have had this disease, myself included. You know, as you know, me, my father-in-law, and my wife, while she was in her second trimester of pregnancy, all caught COVID.
Yes, you did.
And go get the antibody test and say, and say, you know what, I don't have a vaccination card, but here's my card showing that I've got antibodies from having the disease. Because they keep talking about how everybody needs to be vaccinated. Well, roughly 47 to 52% of the people have been vaccinated now in this country. Well, quite a few of us have had the disease and have natural antibodies, which is probably better immunity than the vaccine is going to give you anyway. So if you combine the two, you know, we're well over 70%, which you could call herd immunity. So, I mean, the way around that vaccine mandate will be to get state governments to say, well, we're not going to make our people get the vaccine, but if you have a card showing that you have antibodies from having had the disease, because there's plenty of doctors that have said that if you've had the disease, the vaccine may be dangerous to take, that your body may overreact to it and cause clotting and cause myocarditis. So...
And at the same time, there are people saying that if you've had the disease and you get the vaccine, that like you may as well put a cape on. That like you're going to be immune to all versions of the vaccine. Like I have seen the direct opposite swing of that pendulum, thought form wise. So it's
I would tend to agree that if you've already had the disease, your body has already ramped up its immune system, and then you introduce, you know, the same protein that's going to actually stimulate your cells to produce, because that's the way these mRNA vaccines work. You know, it's not dead virus like the rabies vaccine you give to your dog. It's not, you know, trivalent. You know, it basically, the mRNA goes into your system and it induces your cells to produce the viral spike protein, and then you form an immune response. Well, if you're already forming an immune response, and then you take the vaccine and your cells start producing the spike protein, which your immune system is obviously going to battle because it's already battled it, then you may actually be looking at a hyperimmune response.
Well, and
all of us that treated this COVID disease know that it wasn't the virus that was killing people; it was the body's response to the virus that was killing people.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, even so much so, it's not that there have been a mass number of adverse reactions to no more than any typical number per year, you know, from a flu shot or anything like that regarding Guillain-Barré. And there's a reason why there is a national adverse reaction hotline, folks, with the CDC, because yes, these adverse reactions do happen. There are people that go through anaphylactic shock. There are people that experience these issues. There are people who, whenever they receive these things, go through Guillain-Barré syndrome, that kind of stuff. Absolutely. But the issues with the vaccine, now granted, the issues with the Johnson & Johnson stuff have been freakishly outnumbering the others.
Well, and I think that's because they don't want you to get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. But what you're talking about on the adverse, well, that's just the truth.
Hey, yeah,
but,
yeah.
On the other hand, you're talking about the VAERS unit as the part of the CDC, VAERS,
Yes.
where you report problems with vaccines. Well, the problem with that is then you have to trust the data you're getting from them.
Sure.
And I mean, you know, the CDC's been complicit in a lot of non-consensual experimentation on human beings. So, do you really want to trust to get truthful data from that organization? And personally, most physicians don't.
Yeah. And, that is absolutely true because, I mean, granted, anything done on VAERS or anything like that would be more than a piece in the background to begin with, you know? It would not be anything done or tracked in real time necessarily, you know? So,
well, and if you remember when this first started, you know, we had pretty good anecdotal evidence initially that hydroxychloroquine and that ivermectin both would, if you got it early on, could help keep you off of a ventilator and work. Well, if you remember, and I'm a physician and I'm telling you this from experience, when we had people come in with COVID, if you tried to call the pharmacy and call in a prescription for hydrochloroquine or ivermectin, the first thing the pharmacist asked you was, is this for lupus or for a parasitic disease, or is this for COVID?
Yeah.
And if you said COVID, you were either going to be denied the prescription or, even worse yet, be reported to the board. Now, our medical board, thank God, never did take a stand one way or another, amazingly enough, as bad as our medical board is in Texas. But, I mean, the pharmacists took it into their own hands to control the prescribing. And that was all done politically because, as it turns out, there was evidence that if you took hydroxychloroquine early on that it would help. And there was a lot of evidence that if you took ivermectin early on that it would help. And there was a lot of evidence if you took vitamin D3, because almost all of us have low vitamin D3 levels now, probably because of the amount of stuff we're spraying into the atmosphere. Our skin needs a certain wavelength of light to produce vitamin D. And even oil field workers that work in the sun all day long are coming in with damn near zero vitamin D levels. So there's something causing it. And even the CDC called it a national emergency 10 years ago. That's why we supplement everybody with it.
I have a vitamin D deficiency.
Well, that's because you're as white as a ghost. You never see sun. You stay inside all the time.
That's true. I am a little translucent. Other than I keep saying that one day my freckles will grow together and I'll have a nice tan, you know. One day I will have captured enough souls for my freckles to grow together, because there's a soul for each freckle, according to the ginger theory. But in all reality and in all sincerity, it's absolutely like the information that came out in this panel was just mind-numbing. And the clip I'm about to play right now is Dr. Gerard talking about China actively having a research program to look into ethno-targeting possibilities with DNA research and viruses. And when we're talking about that, folks, that means like specific haplogroups. Like literally, if you wanted to eradicate the redhead population, we have a pretty specific genetic marker. It would be pretty easy to manipulate that and make something happen. You know? It would be pretty easy for them to say, target a race of people like the Uyghurs who were right across the border from them. That kind of stuff. And if you think it's one of those, oh my God, that's the realm of science fiction. It's science fact. Here it is right now.
Finally, if I could, Mr. Chairman, last question is, I think earlier when I was not, had to go vote, Dr. Gerard, you mentioned something about human DNA and American going to China. So I didn't catch that. Could you fill me in?
So,
Love that
Dr. Asher
audio
talked about
quality with the
export
buzz.
controls for biotechnology, and I know he knows this as well or better than I do, but it's not just technology, but it's information, and our genetic information is actually critical. And I do assess that the Chinese have set up circumstances that they're doing a lot of our gene sequencing of Americans that are through normal labs or even through studies at the NIH. And they're doing that for a reason, and that genetic sequences are powerful. They know our vulnerabilities. It is the first step in devising a potentially ethnic weapon, as was discussed by Dr. Asher. And similarly, I don't know if it's still the case, but I believe it is, you're not going to see any genetic sequences of Chinese exported out of the country. That was a law. There's a reason for that. And when we talk about export of technology, export of our genetic information may be the most important key that we need to stop.
Well, I want to make sure I understand this. So American genetic information is going to China. The same China that Dr. Asher talked about is doing bioweapon research with this stuff. And you're saying that combination is of particular concern.
Oh, it is an absolutely huge concern from where I sit. And again, I've been out of the formal bioweapons defense, part of the government for a period of time. But genetic information is very powerful, right? It decides who we are. It tells us about our vulnerabilities, not only disease states, but potential for genetic weapons. And what I mean by that is there are variations in receptors and other things that vary by populations, and those can potentially be exploited so that a new pathogen would differentially target a race, a European ancestry versus someone else. And we are essentially just giving all that information to China in the context of what I unprecedented and
What's
terrifying.
the rationale for giving that to China? I mean,
Well,
I think that's a
because
fundamental question we got to ask on all this. Why are we giving all this information to China?
Because most people in the community are either naive to the threat, they deny the threat, they're oblivious to the threat, or just don't want to think about it. And that's my assessment of many of the people involved in research. It's not that they're evil, it's not they're giving it to them, but they don't just understand what is happening in China and other places. Wow. And we're providing this in a naive fashion across the board. And I just wanted to point out that genetic information, and again, I hope Dr. Dasher would agree with this, but genetic information is one of those things that we should be keeping as a vital national security secret. And not providing it to adversary nations who wish to develop weapons, even openly in the literature.
And there you have it. Like, that is, once again, like, wow, seriously. That's what what really blows my mind, Doc, once again, is let's take a quick look at that fully empty room that that has like more soda cans in the background than people. And I understand COVID is happening, things like that. Mask mandates were dropped. There's one person in that room wearing a mask. It just blows my mind that there was not more media, that there were not more members of the Senate, that there were not more press there covering this topic. And it really kind of echoed something that one of the doctors said during the stuff, talking about blackballing of researchers by China, and the fact is, even we in America, like, you're a filmmaker, there is a Chinese Hollywood that is more powerful than our Hollywood.
Well, and even our Hollywood is mostly Chinese invested now too.
It is.
Because it's people don't go to theaters here anymore. They're building a bunch of new theaters in China. So that is where the new market is.
The
as
release
long as you
of
abide by their rules.
The release of Red Dawn was delayed by a year because they had to completely rewrite it to not be Chinese invaders. Truth. Look it up, folks.
And that's really where the problem lies, is we now live in a country that is so heavily influenced by China, and one of our political parties is so heavily influenced by China that we can't even mount a fight, socially or biologically. And as a matter of fact, if people are wondering how China gets your genetic information, Ancestry.
Yeah, stop
you
giving it to kids and paying to do it. You're paying to do it.
Yep.
You're paying for them to literally sell your information.
Yep, and they're selling your genetic information, and they right now they can legally do so.
Yeah, and I mean, even myself, like with pictures of my son, people ask me what his name is whenever I meet him. People that I work with, stuff like that know me via my social media posts. We work a couple shows a year, and they're like, "What's your son's name? I see T-Man all the time." And I never post his name online because I'm already violating his biometric rights by posting a picture without his permission. Like, socially responsibly, the least I could do is not tie a name to the engine. You know what I mean? Like, they're already getting biometric information that will last an entire lifetime. The last thing I need to do is add a name to tag to that just so it's easier.
Well, and our government has been pretty bad about getting your genetic information.
Oh, sure.
A lot of people don't realize this, but I'm old enough, and you're probably right at the cusp where when you were born, you didn't get a heel stick immediately after birth. But any children that were born after about 1975 or so automatically get a heel stick for PKU, for phenylketonuria. You know how many cases of phenylketonuria I've seen in over 20 years of practice? One. So is it such a dastardly disease that we have to heel stick every child and draw blood from them to rule out phenylketonuria? Well, or do you think it's harvesting their DNA on day one when they're born?
At the very least, giving them a biometric number the same way that we are given a social security number on the day that we're born in this country. At the very least. And yes, I am just old enough to have been heel stuck. Yeah. August 28th, 1975.
And for people who are doubting why China would hit us with a virus that kills the elderly and kills a lot of the people that are 60 and over. Well, the people 60 and over are the ones that are actually have enough life history and weren't brainwashed in our public school system to know that what they need to fight and what they need to accept.
Yeah.
And anybody under 30 that's been educated in one of our universities now has pretty much been indoctrinated. So if you wanted to kill a bunch of people off, you would want to kill the older generation off that knows better.
Yeah. So and has kind of that wherewithal to, even as a 45-year-old, I will properly say, shake my fist and say, "Get off my lawn." You know what I mean? Because that's kind of like psychologically what it is that idea of like, hey, get out of here. I work for this long. Get out of here. And we have to be willing to do that. We have to be willing to put that up. And we have to be willing to put up that fight. And, much like they showed in that clip a while ago, that we had the tech issue coming back from, was that they have specifically targeted that DNA sequence to make it asymptomatic, to make it more virulent, and yet still asymptomatic. And that was shown genetically, because even the odds of it, as they say numerous times in this panel, every single person states the fact that the odds of it jumping from human to people were nil. It had not happened. Before we close up here in just a minute, one of the videos that I wanted to play was from Richard Muller talking of sharing an anecdote from within the industry, doctor, about scientists saying that the Chinese government would gladly blackball folks that were willing to go through and share their stories. So here it is.
A story of that is horrifying and more frightening than almost anything else in my life. In the early days when I was trying to teach myself virology, I called several of my friends who are expert in virology. One of them, I asked him if he could help me review some of this literature, the literature that suggested that there was a lab leak. And he said, no, I'm sorry, Rich, I can't do that. Well, okay, is there someone in your lab who could do it? No, nobody in my lab will do it. Well, why not? Well, let me be candid. If anybody in my laboratory is discovered to be working on a laboratory leak hypothesis, China will label us enemies of China, and the laboratory will be blacklisted, and we will no longer be able to collaborate. We collaborate all the time with China. Nobody will take that risk. This is one of the most chilling conversations I've had in my life. The idea that China has managed to interfere, to break the United States freedom of expression, freedom of investigation, freedom of thought, by through this collaboration effort, really scary. So, let me just say that some people say we will never know, not until China confesses. Or unless there's a whistleblower. Well, we have a whistleblower. It was the virus itself. It came here, it came out of China, it came to us, and it carried with us genetic information. And there are, in my mind, 5 compelling sets of scientific evidence that allow us to reach this very strong conclusion that, yes, it was a laboratory leak. Thank you.
And going through that panel and seeing that video really does lay out. He goes through his 5 steps just before that. I didn't play the whole clip, of course, because to play it would be like 11 minutes long. And even the clip of Dr. Quay, who, once again, hundreds of patents in this realm. Hundreds. Straight up saying it was manipulated. It's shown to be manipulated. To think anything else is more than tomfoolery, it's idiocy. He at one point, he even makes the statement that the odds of you flipping a quarter and hitting heads 1,000 times would be more likely than the fact that this was not manipulated in a lab. That, like, just staggering, doctors. So to know where we have
and
come
like I
to,
said, and what's even
go ahead.
scarier is what the next virus is going to be.
Yeah, yeah. Don't forget that oddly enough, the whole theory behind coronavirus and its attachment to Bill Gates came from the fact that there was a study done by the Gates Foundation regarding a virus much like corona that originated in Venezuela, which is having like a huge problem with corona right now. And even now we are dealing with, much like we said at the beginning of this segment, Doctor, mutation upon mutation upon mutation. And as opposed to a normal zoonotic virus, something that would jump species border that took decades to be able to do it, and become virulent to humans in the process. You know, like number one, it crossing over and being deadly on this mass scale would be astronomic enough. But for it to have reacted the way it was, and not be genetically manipulated, as these scientists say, literally impossible. Literally.
Well, and for your listeners that are interested, there is a great book out that you can read that basically is the blueprint of possibly the reason that COVID may have been released, and it's called COVID-19, The Great Reset. And basically it's by Klaus Schwab, who's the World Economic Forum chairman and is a big UN guy, basically saying that this would be the crisis after the shutdowns and the economic collapse and collapse of healthcare, that this would be the time to actually finish converting over into a one world government and a one world socialist hierarchy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and he lays out the whole plan there. And that book was written well into the pandemic. It's not recently written. It was written in 2020, but just speculating that this may be a big enough global crisis to clamor to a one world government.
Absolutely.
And a one world government, which obviously would be socialistic.
And you know, whether or not you go into and believe it or not, but like we have the document on dudesandbeer.com, on our sister site curiousrealm.com, and our knowledge vault. Feel free to go check out Agenda 21. It's a real thing. It exists. And the concept of depopulation and the theory of depopulation and how to do it has definitely existed. The things that you were mentioning right now, John Hall, are no different. Hold on. No different, mind you, than the technology behind an audio spotlight. That's an audio spotlight, like put into a casing. Ladies and gentlemen, this is I'm going to be working on some ultrasonic levitation experiments, things like that. But the technology that we talk about regularly, Doctor, where it's ultrasonic technology that can be focused in one area, there it is. This is like what museums use to give you an audio experience in a 3-foot range, that kind of stuff. This technology exists. It's out there. It's readily available. As they say in the testimony in here, you can go out and buy kits for the base genetic code, the CGCG protein chain. Like, you can buy them for CRISPR and stuff like that. Like, you can buy a genetic mod kit for your desk the same way I have all this rack gear to make music, and I can buy that ultrasonic device. It's absolutely phenomenal. And before we leave, Doctor, the one last clip that I want to play is quite literally Dr. Stephen Quay, who his testimony was the one that was, once again, ladies and gentlemen, I love my audience. I love you, Doc. I love all you guys. I'm not denying the fact that this thing exists. What we have to remember is, much like the gentleman said earlier, this is quite literally a 9/11 type situation where we knew the information was there. Nothing was done. We knew. We knew this was happening. We know this is happening. When you're talking about most of our genetic coding being outsourced in a country, you need to worry about that, folks, like they just got finished saying. And here is Dr. Stephen Quay.
So if you go on the internet and want to do, you can do DNA tests for almost anything on the internet as a consumer, and you don't even need, a doctor to sign. And you do a scrape, you do a spit. The specimen will very often go to a laboratory here, but then it gets shipped to BGI, which Dr. Ash will say bought more Illumina sequencing machines than any place in the world, and so they will do the sequence there, and they'll send it back to the company. But guess what? They'll keep a copy, and that's what he's talking about. So every time in America, not always, but many times, what you think is and you'll go to a U.S. address, and then it gets shipped to BGI.
Yeah.
And he's quite literally during that clip, folks, where he's like, you do, and he's doing like a mouth swab motion, talking about the fact of you do a kit for something like Ancestry.com, things like that. And you think it's going to a secure location in like Poughkeepsie. Hey, these folks are right up the road. They're in New Jersey, They're American-based. Sure, the company is American-based, but the fact is that stuff is fully going overseas to a Chinese company for processing on the uber cheap, and at the same time, a copy of your genetic code is being saved by a foreign government to be used for research such as this. Just mind-numbing to think about, Doctor. Really, it's quite literally the stuff of sci-fi nightmares. And
it's a really easy trap to fall in, because a lot of those commercials or a lot of the companies are saying, send. Tell you what DNA, what diseases you may expect and can prevent later on, or we'll tell you, if you had a relative that was in the Civil War, and they make it really elegantly advertised to suck you in. But greed is a powerful thing, and if China's paying big bucks to these companies for them to send copies to them, they're going to send them, just like our government has sold us out to China for the
Darn
most part.
tootin' Bubba, same way that the government, if you think your Alexa, I have a power switch on my Alexa over here so that I can make sure, if it's free, you are the product, your opinions, everything. We say that all the time, Doctor. And it's the same thing. If you think that genetic code for $29.95 or $100 is cheap, there's a reason. So, Doc, I can't thank you enough for coming on you do.
That's why Facebook is free. The people on it are the product.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, 100%, my friend, 100%. So, speaking of Facebook, thank you so much, as always, for sharing amongst your community and sharing our community with your community, and likewise back and forth. It's been a fantastic relationship over the last many years, and it's been great to talk with many of the people in your community and be able to be there for them. So I thank you for that.
And I think everyone appreciates it, and it's always a pleasure to be on, Chris.
Absolutely.
And I will see you next time.
Absolutely. You take care. We're going to go ahead and let you go while we close things out. I'll, of course, send you a shameful link to the episode, all that kind of stuff. Like I told you earlier, you're one of the only people that I know in this whole industry, period, even podcaster-wise, even show host-wise, that I don't have to be like, hey, share this link. You actively share links. You're out there trying to get this information out there, and that's something to be remembered, folks, is much like people like, Mike Heston in the UFO UAP community on Facebook. You are one of many people that whenever you wrote your books, Guinea Pigs, Technologies of Control, and Satellite Breed, A New Terrorism, you quite literally risked the letters behind your name to write them, and your lawyers told you so. Your confederates in your professional industry told you so, yet still you saw the onus to do it. So good on you.
Well, I appreciate that, Chris, and I will be on the next show.
Absolutely.
When the next tribulation comes along.
Absolutely. You take care, my friend. We will talk to you very, very soon. Of course, while you're online checking out all the great work of Dr. John Hall, all of his books are available right there on Amazon. You can go check it out. You can, of course, check out all of his episodes right here on the Dudes and Beer podcast, dudesandbeer.com. That is where you can find everything. That's where you can find the Knowledge Vault. In addition to that, make sure to stop on by Curious Realm. That is our sister site, soon to be our home site. We will be transforming come episode 351. 350 is the official last episode of Dudes and Beer. 351 will be episode 1 of Curious Realm. Until next time, everybody, take care of yourselves.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Dudes and Beer podcast.
Be good at it. We'll talk to you soon.
To listen to our audio streams or chat with us live, download the official Dudes and Beer app for Android and iDevices, available on Google Play and iTunes markets. For more episodes, content, and information, visit us online at dudesandbeer.com. You can also find our episodes on Breach.tv, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, SoundCloud, iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast service. Dudes and Beer is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. For more about our sponsors and other podcasts on this network, visit hcuniversalnetwork.com. Thanks for listening, everybody, and until next time, drink responsibly.